You are about to watch an excerpt from a longer presentation.
Greetings. Welcome once more to this platform. My name is Capo Daniel. We'll have a very deep presentation today about King Charles' visits to Germany. In Germany, with the Queen's consort, that's how they call the wife of the king. It is a historic visit. He was due to make this trip to France, but that trip was cancelled because of the protests in France. But this is a very historic visit, and I want us to pay attention very, very closely to the details of the speech he gave together with the president of Germany.
In diesem festlichen Rahmen danken soll. Es ist wunderbar, heute Abend in so großen sind und
So you can see Angela Merkel, who is there, the former chancellor of Germany, and Prince Charles started this speech in German. He spoke in German, and to highlight the need for the connection of these kingdoms. Remember, during the olden days, kings would get married because of diplomatic reasons, and it's going to build forces with other nations based on these personal relationships. So, how leaders interact with each other and form this relationship between their people is very important. Look, for example, the union between the Ague of Sea and the IPOB of the Biafra, the leadership of Dr. Chuayaba, and Mazi Nnamdi Kanu have brought a lot of Ambazonians closer with the Biafran people. This is very important. And these are some things we don't see across the continent Africa. You don't see African presidents traveling to other African countries with the weight of their state and their people being engaged in this friendly manner, exchanging cultural exchanges. And these are very crucial in building nations, alliances, and affecting foreign policy of government. And Angela Merkel, I want to
mich nicht mit einem Dinner for one alleine lassen.
I want you to look at her behind. Angela Merkel, she's one of my favorite leaders. She's a very powerful woman, and I want to highlight this particular issue. You can see the president of Germany. The president of Germany do not have executive power. He's more like a king, actually, because he doesn't have presidential power, executive power, but he have a ceremonial rule, and he's a head of state. He holds the sovereignty, but he does not govern. And we have to understand all these systems of government because it's very important that we are not just blindsided with the whole idea of a president, parliament in an abstract form, but we have to know what these things means and what the title means. This is England. It's a kingdom ruled not by the king, but ruled by the prime minister. And the king, who holds the sovereignty of the state, do not have any executive power. All these type of system are peculiar to that same country and its culture and its people and how they think and how they express themselves. And it's very important that we know all these things so that we can best be able to have a political system in Africa, in Ambazonia, or wherever you think that will best suit our people and serve their need. I want to use this opportunity to talk a little bit about Angela Merkel, which you see her behind there. She was the former German chancellor. The German, they don't have, the executive is not a prime minister like in UK. It's called a chancellor. So she was a chancellor, the person that rules German, that governs German, that exercises the power of German is a chancellor. She had 4 terms of office. One of those terms, I think, lasts for 4 years. So four will be, she has been in power for 16 years between 2005 and 2021. Her political party is called the Christian Democratic Union. And I want you to pay attention that she has been in power for longer than many African presidents have been in power. So our Africans should understand that the problem is not that people stay in power for long. We might be angry with Paul Biya and the presidents in many African countries. The reasons why we should be angry with them is not just that they have stayed in power for long, because you can stay in power doing something very good in your country. There's also a good need for rotation because you don't want to become a generational theft. Every generation have the right to have an impact or an imprint in the history of their country. But leaders can stay in power for long and it will be good for their country. In the case of Angela Merkel, she stayed in power for long term and people wanted her to stay even more because she was doing a marvelous job. But for people like Paul Biya who have bankrupted their country, caused huge mass migration because of poverty and destitution, ruin their economy, become an indebted country, it becomes a sin, an eyesore for someone like that to stay that long in power. And you remember the chancellor, if you think about it, the Germans, if they call the chancellor, an English word for chancellor would mean like a judge. You remember the exchequer, the chancellor of the exchequer, that is the name of the chief, of the head of the British treasury, the chief financial minister, the position is called chief financial minister is called the chancellor of exchequer. So you see, chancellor, for us to talk chancellor in the university, so you have to understand these titles, and we shouldn't be so obsessed about having a president, and that we can have something different depending on our own system. So personal relationship are the basis of strengthening state relationship. And previously, kings used to be above the law. Kings used to be the law. But now we live in a modern era where the constitution is the law and nobody is above that law. Everybody is now subject to constitutions, not just to people. And we have to know that in Africa so that we can build a system where people are subject to the constitution, like in the United States and countries that have developed. Let's get into this speech.
I think, Mr. President, of the particular kindness and friendship which you and Frau Budenbender showed to both my wife and myself on our last visits to Berlin in 2019 and 2020. I also think fondly of the time my wife and I sampled Bavarian sausages at a farmer's market in Munich and found ourselves drinking beer and waltzing around at the Hofbrauhaus.
So this is fantastic. When you have the king talking about his personal experience with his wife in Germany, that connection between the people enhances the state's commitment and the people's unity. Where in Africa, our leaders spend their time in holiday in France, spend their times in jacuzzi in Switzerland, Europeans spend times visiting each other's country to develop that love and knowledge about each other's country. In Africa, we don't travel to each other's country, we travel to abroad. We travel to the white man's land. Imagine if African leaders were to be taking holidays in other African states, how it is going to encourage collaboration, taking away the idea of being a foreigner. Africans do not know about Africa. Most Africans discover other Africans' history and people in the diaspora, not back home. So this is very important for us Africans. I learned that later in my life, and I've been trying to travel. I've visited a couple of African states, and I try to continue to do that to engage them, and I'll be doing that more and more as I have the opportunity and the means to afford that. But this is very important. You may wonder why the president in such a very important speech will be talking about personal relationship. Those personal connections matter. Those personal connections deep. That is why in Africa we are cool about what happens in other African states. Many Africans are not aware or feel sympathetic about the Africans that are being slaughtered in Ambazonia, in Biafra, in Congo, and elsewhere in Africa because they don't know these people. They don't have any connection or any story of their leader connecting with these people. And so we are left with ourselves. And tomorrow we turn and we blame the white man. When there are flood and drought in Africa, it is not Africans who even care or help. It is the Europeans and the Americans and the Chinese and the Russians. When Africans are fighting and killing each other, those who step in the middle are not Africans for the most part. So we have to understand how these things work and how we have to build them. Let's go on.
I think I can understand why St. Boniface, an English monk who is famous for having preached in Germany, is also a patron saint. Our countries are working together to promote global health, to help developing countries overcome their challenges and prosper, and to advance the urgent and vital journey towards net zero. And of course, we stand side by side in protecting and advancing our shared democratic values. This is epitomized so clearly today as we stand together with Ukraine in defense of freedom and sovereignty in the face of unprovoked aggression.
So, ladies and gentlemen, this is a clock of the matter where the King of England, he said that we stand side by side in protecting and advancing our shared democratic value. That is epitomized so clearly as they stand together with Ukraine in defense of two things: freedom and sovereignty in the face of an unprovoked act of aggression. I will get to that, and I want you people to find what builds the alliance in Europe and the West. He talks about their shared values of democracy. These are countries that have a shared value that their government should seek legitimacy through popular vote, where their people rule themselves through democratic process. This value is very important for them. The defense of freedom that is protected within this system. But even more fundamental are the two issues which they say they stand hand in hand, shoulder to shoulder, to defend in Ukraine: the issue of freedom and sovereignty, which is what I'm about to go deep into, because these are the fundamentals of international law. If you are an African person, Ambazonia, Biafra, people from Bongasvi, wherever you are in the world, these are the most fundamental principles that safeguard human freedom and shared values and way of life whatsoever. The issue of freedom and sovereignty. Freedom is having the power to choose. When you have a power to choose and make changes politically, then you can say if people are free. When people are free, they can choose their leaders, they can have the power to make political changes, they have freedom of speech, freedom of political participation, and all those things are guaranteed through constitutions and laws within a sovereign state. So every people should have that right. If you are a people, like most peoples in Africa, like those in the Biafra, that the state have been designed to disenfranchise you, that people from your area can never ascend to power, then you have no choice. You don't have freedom. The people from Ambazonia that are called the so-called Anglophones or English-speaking Cameroonians, that have the system is designed to keep them in a position where they are stripped of the possibility of becoming a president or having that power or prestige of the office of the president, then they are not free. They don't have that freedom. These are the very important things that you have to know. Whether it is in Kenya, where you have the Luos, or in Uganda, where you have some specific tribes, that the system is designed to make them unable to have power, then we have a very serious problem where people are not free and they need freedom in all those areas. They have to be very conscious of this lack of freedom, and they need to assure in their institutions and in their constitutions that they safeguard the freedom of every group of minority. Democracy is about minorities' right of equal participation, and the protection from marginalization of any minority group within a country, so that they can create that space where everybody can live in an equitable society and excel in science and technology and all the things that man is meant to enjoy. While the Europeans talks about this value in the case of Ukraine, the protection of freedom and sovereignty, which is the geared towards maintaining the core value, democratic value of the West. Democracy in Africa have become a tool to legitimize tyranny and oligarchy across the African continent. The French government promotes a system of dynasty in Africa, whether it is in Togo, where the president will die, they will replace him with a son, in Gabon, where they are doing the same, and in Cameroon, where we expect them to do the same. All over Africa, what they push to us as democracy is not what they have as democracy. The French are pushing for a dynastic type of regime, and the British, on the other hand, are giving a blind eye to dictators such as Mussolini and many other dictators across Africa. Even in Rwanda, where they have economic prosperity, there is still tyranny going on there and a lack of continuity of democracy for the people of Rwanda to be able to choose who they want as a leader. You have a lot of Rwanda refugees who are running away from their country as well. So these are very fundamental things that we all Africans should have. Freedom. Only freedom can guarantee sustainable development and the growth, the advancement in science and technology. And we must advocate for everybody in Africa to be to feel free. And now I will go to what is even more important, what he talks about sovereignty, the fight for sovereignty, and why the Europeans are fighting to hold sovereignty in Ukraine. Sovereignty is the supreme power and authority, the supreme power and authority of a state that is exercised by a people through governance of their territory. Every state have a sovereign state. You also have popular sovereignty, which is the principle that the authority of a state and its power to govern are all created and sustained by the people of that state, which is obtained by their government through consent, and those consent are given through vote. That means the people authorizes a government to rule over them through vote. That supreme authority comes from the people. But more importantly, what we want to talk about are two things of sovereignty: the national sovereignty and the state sovereignty of a country. Every country with its international borders have this right and protection that is supreme and that is paramount for international law and international politics. National sovereignty and territory, a right to a defined territory and its people to decide for themselves without outside interference on their outlook and international affair. And then you have state sovereignty, which is under international law is recognized as a people, a population who have competence to interact with other sovereign state. So in the case of Ambazonia, you may ask, is Ambazonia a sovereign state? Ambazonia have been a sovereign state. Yes, we had been a sovereign state because our country under international law is defined as a recognized people with recognized international borders that are competent to interact with other sovereign states. When we were self-governance, we had the capacity to engage in diplomatic exchanges with other competent states. We did so, and we participated in the United Nations in that capacity. That is why we are state people. And that was why it was very important. You see that the Palestinian as well was given a seat in the United Nations to sit and to engage with other states to assure the international community that they meet that definition of what is a people. This is very critical for our understanding of Ambazonia. We have never had national sovereignty, but we have had enjoy state sovereignty. And full sovereignty will come with national sovereignty, where it is a right of a defined people within a defined border to decide for them their political outlook and engages in international affairs as a recognized country. So these are the two things, and I'm going to get to the fundamental of these two things. I'll play the rest of this video of this speech of King Charles, and I will take you to the fundamentals of international law about sovereignty and freedom that is very relevant today for our case in Ambazonia as we seek to assert ourselves and other African people across our continent.
In this regard, I did want to pay a particular tribute to Germany's extraordinary hospitality in hosting over 1 million Ukrainian refugees. This, it seems to me, so powerfully demonstrates the generosity of spirit of the German people.
So what I want our people to understand is that you find the King of England congratulating and talking about the hospitality of the Germans, who have received over 1 million refugees from Ukraine. while African refugees are being returned back to Africa, shipped back to Africa. We saw the same thing. The German opened their borders for Syrian refugees to into Europe. But when it comes to black people, we are being turned back. And our people have to know the basis for this international law and this principle so that you can see both the hypocrisy of the West and also geared our case in a manner that is going to attract the right attention to make a case to the rest of the West in a meaningful manner that can be acted upon. So I want to let you people know about the whole issue that the international law, what is the foundation of international law. Today, international law is based on the United Nations Charter. The United Nations Charter, an alliance and treaties are the basis for today's international law. We have had previous systems like the League of Nations that did not succeed because it established an international law system that was based on the Berlin Conference. The Berlin Conference was when the European countries that were interacting internationally, they decided that those countries should come together and create an international law that could arbitrate conflicts that comes with interactions of many European countries in Africa primarily. And they have to draw the map of the war and set the stage for the international law order at that period. But we now have a new war order that is based on the United Nations Charter. And I'm going to tell you the fundamentals of the United Nations Charter. It will equip you with the knowledge to understand the justice and the injustices that you are going through or you might get yourself into, and best possible ways on how you can approach and maximize our chances to defeat anything that holds us slavery and takes away our freedom. The international law today, as we know, it stems from a treaty that they call the Atlantic Charter. It was signed between the British government and the American government, between it was President Franklin Roosevelt and the Prime Minister Winston Churchill in the Atlantic Ocean, somewhere in the British territory in the Atlantic Ocean, and they signed this agreement. Before this agreement was signed, the world was confronted with the aggression of the German government. German was expanding their territory, conquering other European territory, imposing themselves, and it was an existential threat. Or it was called the Anglo-Soviet Agreement. It was signed by the Exchequer of England and the foreign minister of agent of the foreign minister of Russia and the Americans. They brought the three of them. The church brought the three of them to make a commitment to each other that they will not have peace with Germany alone. That everything they do, they must do it together. So this is the beginning of how they form the alliances that are the base of today international law. And you would know what these principles are, so that you will know where your place is. You will know what you can do in the international law and what you can expect. So this is the foundation of the international law. These three countries, they gather together. You have the England, the Russians, at that time it was the Soviet Union, and the America. They form what they call the Anglo-Soviet Agreement. This agreement now formed the basis where they came up with the Atlantic Charter. That is why sometimes you find the Chinese, they always make the statement that there is no global consensus about the world values, because things can be different for everybody across the world. One person may say that a pork is a meat. In another person, a pork is a poison. In one area, people can eat frog. In another area, people cannot eat. So what is right in one place may be wrong in another place. What you choose as a system in your area may be seen as not a system in another area. So the Chinese was not in a part of this group, but eventually they joined the United Nations Charter. So I'll tell you how it started. It started there in this small agreement. Then now the British government and the American government, who were close, they decided to come up with this treaty, which was meant to bring the Americans to come and help them to fight against Germany. And they saw that there was a need to form a new war order, an international law and way of doing things internationally that is going to guarantee war peace. The Americans, they saw this war happening in everywhere. but they knew that it would come to them because after this issue, you have the attack on the Pearl Harbor where the Japanese attacked the Americans. So the problem at that time was the German aggression and the Japanese imperial expansion. These were the two problems that brought the war together. So you have the Americans, President Roosevelt, and the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. They came together to sign this charter that had 8 points. I'm going to read the points to you, and these are the basis of the international law. So that when you talk about justice, you talk about expectation, you should know where it comes from. It comes from the document that came as a result of the British and the Americans signing as a vision of the war, what the war should be, what international law should guarantee, the only way you can protect peace for the war. And it came from an understanding with the Russians, but the Americans wanted to do it and have it like the Western things, so they went ahead to do it together with the American and England, which is called the Atlantic Charter. It had 8 points. This is the handwriting one that was being scrabbled to do the treaty, rewrite it again. So this is the Atlantic Charter. It says it had 8 points. The first is no territorial aggrandizement. That means these nations they agree that for the war to be peace, no territory shall expand from its recognized border. That is the only way you can guarantee war peace. The second is that territorial adjustment must be in accord with the wishes of the people concerned. That if you want to adjust any territory, it must be done with the agreement of the people that are concerned with those territory. But you saw how in Ambazonia, we were transferred into Cameroon against our wishes because we expressed our wishes was for independence. You saw in Nigeria, the Biafrans during the amalgamation were not consulted, they were not given their consent. And in many other parts in Africa where you have wars, is because the Europeans violated this core principle that they had signed as law and knew that it is the basis for war peace, but yet they violate it repeatedly in Africa. And in every place, I guarantee you, these violations are the cause of 90% of the wars and killing and famine in Africa. If they just respect these same rules, they accepted that is the basis of war peace, we will have freedom in Africa today and will not be fighting all the wars we are fighting. The third one was all people have right to self-determination. All people. Now the problem is, how do you define a people? Is people the Com people a people? Wimbum people? Is it the the Bakwere people? The Mbangen people? People in Fontem? The people in this sense was not defined, but it is seen generally like a sovereign people, a sovereign state, or a country that is recognized. But for me as an African, I believe in our own context, the various African indigenous people with their own unique languages form the internal peoples of Africa whose identity must be preserved within the state and their own rights, unique rights and entitlement also preserved for us to have eternal peace within our own African borders. The fourth point agreement was international trade goal, that they should have world traders where you have the treaty of the world trade was formed. You also have the fifth one which talk about global economic cooperation for humanity. The world must cooperate so that they have efficiency. Efficiency is that if a country can produce something at a very low cost, they can have the advantage to be able to supply everywhere. That global concept is also embedded in the next treaties that have been signed to ensure that the World Trade Organization is indeed global. You also have the sixth position, which talk about global cooperation for a war free of fear and want. This is where you have developed the treaty that they protect people who are facing political persecution, and all the war have the obligation to stand against oppression of people and the use of fear and also the use of wants. That means poverty. Number 7 is freedom of navigation, that created the laws of international waters. There are international waters where everybody is free to navigate. Then number 8, you have the disarmament of aggressor nations and the common disarmament after the Second World War. Disarmament of aggression nation, it means if a state is declared as an aggressor, like Iraq violated its sovereignty and attacked Kuwait, then the world expect that country to disarm. That's why you saw the whole issue of everybody in the United Nations saying that they must disarm Saddam Hussein. That was because it was considered as an aggressor state. When the Americans, they also attacked other countries, they were aggressors. Now Russia have become an aggressor because they have violated the borders, the sovereignty of Ukraine, but it should apply for everybody. If they respect, everybody respect these rules, the world will be perfectly peace. It will be peace on earth like Jesus Christ promised. So St. James Palace. So I'll get to that. So this Atlantic Charter between the British government and the American government, they didn't want the Soviets to be involved in this, so that the Soviets would not be seen as part of this system, but it was born by them. Now it was signed in August 1941. No, it was signed earlier on in June 1941. You now had the Americans and the British government invited the Canadian government, the Australian government, New Zealand government, South African, Belgium, Poland, and Norway to sign in St. James Palace, where the King James Bible was commissioned in this palace. It was very symbolical for those Christians, crusaders, the churches that are all behind pushing the peace vision of the war, the belief of Christ. So the Church of England, these things are very significant for them. So anyway, politically, let's forget about the religious issue. They invited these countries to come and sign this charter in St. James Palace. You had these countries that I've named. They came over there and they signed, including Yugoslavia. They signed this charter that formed the basis of the United Nations. And later on, a conference was called in the United States called the United Nations Conference on International Organization, where over 51 countries were invited, and they came and they signed on June 26, 1945, the United Nations Charter. That organization that was created is the United Nations and formed the basis of the international law. Since then, the membership have grown now to over all countries in the world, and they have become the primary guarantor of international law. So if you want to think about international law, you must think about these fundamental principles. This is a founding document, and the founding principles, when they talk about freedoms and democracy, guarantee of international law, the right of sovereignty, all stems from these laws. So these are very important international instruments and mindset that our people have to have, so that they can be able to advocate for the various people's rights across the globe. Once more, I'm going to play the speech of King Charles, so that I can a little bit dwell on this perspective.
This is epitomized so clearly today as we stand together with Ukraine in defense of freedom and sovereignty in the face of unprovoked aggression.
So, ladies and gentlemen, while the world preaches the need for their shared value of democracy, what we see as their policy in Africa is the opposite. The French government have been sustaining a system of dynasty in Africa that undermines democracy. They have promoted state coup d'etat in Chad that undermines democracy in favor of a dynasty of the president's son taking over power from his father. They have done the same thing in Togo. They are trying to do the same thing in Cameroon, which they will succeed. The British government undermines African democracy by promoting oligarchy and tyranny. We have seen that in Uganda. And they keep on using election as a tool to legitimize dictatorship. The president of countries such as in Congo were assassinated by the Americans. So definitely, when it comes to Africa, these people do not hold or uphold that same value. And we must call against this hypocrisy from the West. If we can learn anything from King Martin Luther King, was that it is the reminder to the white men that all men were born equal, that their own creed should be upheld, and that they should live according to their creed that leads to the compassion and freedom of the Black Americans. And we must hold the same for the British government and the West about Africa. What about their core democracy in democratic value in Africa? Do the Nigerian government represent a democratic state that the West should stand and deal business with? Do they not have alternative in Nigeria when the Nigerian people en masse have voted for Peter Obi? The Americans and the West who want the Nigerian people to give a blind eye to accommodate them, and they will say try later. The same goes in Uganda, where you have a dictator undermining Bobby Wine, and all the West will do is say just go along with it. In Cameroon is the same thing. All across Africa is the same thing. Does African life really matter? Should we live in a war where they say that in Africa we must just suffer what we have to suffer, while the strong and the powerful take what they have to take? But we see in Ukraine, the war and the West come together for their shared principles of democracy to defend the honor and dignity of the Ukrainian people. What about us in Africa? If we cannot count on the West, it is upon us, the African people, to build a democratic alliance and network of Pan-Africans who can also go home and fight for our own democracy, who can campaign hard against tyranny and dictatorship to uphold the value that can help us develop in science and technology and give a life of dignity to our own people. It is up to us to seize upon this opportunity. The West is not going to come. We know for sure that many Europeans objected to the Atlantic Charter to be applied globally because some of them do not even believe that us Africans will deserve this right. But we know better. We know ourselves. We shouldn't wait for other people to love us, but we should uphold our own self, fight for our own poor, and protect them against tyranny and dictatorship, and advocate for African people across the globe. This is our own prerogative, and this is our mission we must embrace. You also talk about the issue of sovereignty. The African Charter has also reiterated this same principle, that no African state should expand its border beyond what it attained its independence. We have seen that these have been the main cause of war, whether you talk about Ethiopia and Eritrea, where they tried to join countries that were not previously joined against the wishes. This is important, against the wishes of those people. In Sahel, northern Sahel region, in the Biafran, they don't want to be part of Nigeria. In everywhere you have our people fighting for the same thing. And we must establish these principles, and we must speak about these principles and uphold these principles and empower our people with knowledge, because knowledge is power. And with power, we can free ourselves from all the shackles of slavery, including mental slavery. And I hope my campaign will give you something to think about, something to pray about, something to share with your other African friends. Even one person. It takes just one dedicated person to change a nation. I hope we will find a better world for our generation and the generation to come to live in, as we even fight for our own freedom back home in Amazonia.